Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about advanced democracies. Before we do this, here's a review question, which if we were in class, we would talk about now. And I'll probably put this up as a discussion thread for you to think about. What I'd like you to do is create a list of advantages and disadvantages of SMD and PR systems. So go back through your notes and think about some good things and some bad things about these various SMD systems and the PR system. And think about what you would recommend for an ethnically diverse country emerging from a highly destructive civil war. So this will be a question that will likely go up on the discussion thread. So today, when we talk about advanced democracies, we are by nature talking about consolidated democracies, which are defined as those that have highly institutionalized political structures and high levels of economic development and wealth. All advanced democracies emphasize participation, competition, liberty, and capitalism, though to varying degrees. They're also all oriented towards modern as opposed to traditional values. And they do all tend to be wealthy. So if you look at the map over here, what you'll find is I take that back. They tend to be wealthy, but they don't have to be wealthy. So there's a strong correlation. Advanced democracies in particular are wealthy. And we'll get into that later. But consolidated democracies by no means have to be wealthy. So in terms of some consolidated democracies, this is a bit older. And in fact, we've seen some changes. Mexico has actually fallen back in 2011 to a partly free. Whether I agree with that or not is a different question. But so many of these are consolidated democracies. India, Mongolia, clearly not wealthy countries. You've got Latin American countries, including Peru and Chile and Brazil. Well, Brazil is much wealthier than the other two. Argentina. We've got Botswana and Namibia, and then South Africa being the economic powerhouse. You've got Australia over here. But the usual suspects are up here, Western European states, in particular in the north. We've got some troubled areas down here in the former Yugoslavia, and then, of course, the United States and Canada. So if you look at the correlation between these democracies, okay, there is a pretty strong correlation between per capita GDP and consolidated democracy, but not a perfect correlation by any means. All of these countries do have quite, or I should say, when we talk about advanced democracies, which are different from consolidated democracies, they're a different breed in themselves. You will find that they have quite a degree of diversity. You have liberal democracies that have a heavy focus on individual freedoms, and then you have social democracies, which have a heavier focus on collective equality, essentially. So the United States would fit farther on the liberal scale, and what this chart shows you right here is social expenditures. And so the United States is fairly low in terms of advanced democracies. It is quite low on this scale. And then you move up, and you'll find Scandinavia, Sweden over here, Norway, oddly, is down here, but Denmark, very close to Sweden, Austria and France, with much higher levels of spending. Okay, so what we mean by social expenditures are essentially redistributive policies. And note that the EU social expenditures are particularly high, and they're all spending over the OSCE average. In fact, not all of them, but all of them that are spending over the OSCE average are members of the European Union or close to the European Union within Europe. You've got a few that are spending underneath, but then the ones that are spending the least are the United States, Turkey, Mexico, and Korea, and Canada, which are clearly outside of Europe, because it only goes up from there. And then we've got Japan in here. So the take-home point here is that advanced democracies are wealthy, okay, but they have a difference in focus. There's a diversity in focus between liberal and social democratic states. There's also a lot of major differences with respect to these issues, which we'll talk about. So direct democracy, for example. We talked about the use of referenda in the last class. The U.S. does it on the state level. Switzerland really leads the way in this. In Switzerland, all federal laws are subject to a referendum if you can get 50,000 signatures. For laws on the local level, you just need 1% of the signatures. And then you can get that up for a referendum. Anyone with 100,000 signatures in Switzerland can get an initiative, a national initiative, going. Um, so this is a different way than in most representative democracies. In terms of voting, we also have major differences. There's compulsory voting in countries such as Australia and Argentina and about 20 other countries. If you don't show up to vote in Australia, you get fined. Now, before this, they had about 50% or so turnout, a little bit less. Now it's around 95% turnover. No, I'm sorry, turnout. Now, this is great. I mean, it's a civic obligation. It's a civic obligation. The government knows that everyone, um, they know the will of everyone, and this can help minimize resentment, which could theoretically lead to violence. So that's great. On the other hand, some people might call this horrible. It's undemocratic. You've got the ignorant voter problem. Do these guys really know what's going on? Are they really capable of making an informed vote? It's also very hard to enforce in countries such as Brazil, where you've got the favelas, these slums that have been really, nothing's been enforced in them for a long time. How do you actually go about enforcing that? Now, of course, that's an example of a non-advanced democracy. We'll get into the definition of advanced democracies in a few minutes. But within these advanced democracies and other democracies, we've got differences with respect to military service. It's compulsory in some states. In the U.S., we sign up for military service, but we haven't had a draft since Vietnam, since 1973. In Germany, you sign up and you join for 9 months for men. It's voluntary for women. If you're a conscientious objector in Germany, you can perform alternative services, such as getting involved in technical aid or foreign development, serve in the fire department. In Israel, much further on this scale, you finish high school, you turn 18, all men and women have to serve unless you're pregnant or a religious woman. Israeli Arabs are also not obliged, but men do 3 years, women do 2 years, and then they do reserve duty up until their 40s. For women, it's up until their 20s, which is about 45 days a year. Conscientious objectors there rarely occur. So from here, we could start asking lots of comparative questions. What might explain the differences? A security situation, a country's wealth, right? But all these countries that I mentioned, Germany and Israel and the U.S., are wealthy. Tradition, maybe social pressures. It's okay to be a conscientious objector in Germany, where it's a much more pacifist country after World War II, but certainly not in Israel, where they're surrounded by potential enemies. So these are lots of issues. These countries also differ with respect to levels of inclusion. For example, think about the rights of prisoners to vote. In the U.S., only 2 states allow prisoners to vote. Is this fair? Well, think about California's 3-strike law. If you get thrown into jail 3 times, and they could be petty offenses, you get life sentences. So someone could be in jail for, I don't know, something bad, like, beating someone up, then they could be put in jail another time for another felony, selling drugs. And then the 3rd time, they could walk into a store or pizza place, and they could steal a slice of pizza. And then that 3rd time, if they go to jail for that 3rd time, they're going to go in for life. So is it fair to not allow for these people to actually be able to influence the law? I'll give you another case for the sake of comparativism. In South Africa, prisoners consistently contested this law, that they couldn't actually vote. And since the first free elections in 1994, when South Africa became a democratic state, finally, the Constitutional Court in 2004 ruled that prisoners can vote, because otherwise it weakens the government's ability to function as representative of these excluded citizens. So again, we can compare. What might explain the difference between, for example, the U.S. and South Africa? We've got a history of prison use that focused on political prisoners in South Africa. You've got different political pressures, etc. You can come up with a long list of variables that you might want to test. Again, in terms of things like liberty, we've got abortion, the death penalty, major differences. Many democracies around the world outlaw or allow abortion. So in France, abortion is allowed in the first 12 weeks. In Portugal, until a few years ago, it was only allowed if a woman's life is in danger, okay, not poverty or other reasons. Then they held a referendum, and they actually voted to allow, well, that in itself is interesting, a referendum on abortion. So when do you use referenda? Okay, and so at this point, the prime minister got the political capital back around 2007 to change the laws. and and abortion is legal there. Again, what might explain these differences? The death penalty. Um, Here's actually a little chart for you. Those blue states are those which have no death penalty. Green is only for very horrible crimes during war or exceptional times. Orange is it's been abolished in practice, and red is that it's a legal form of punishment. So in 2002, after years of bans in individual countries, the EU formally banned the death penalty in all member states. You can see the only European country up here that has the death penalty as a legal form of punishment is Belarus. Clearly not in the European Union, has no chance of getting in. The U.S. is actually relatively rare in terms of consolidated democracies. I believe it's or advanced democracies. It's the only one. We're not in particularly good company. A list from 2010 shows with countries of 15 or more executions shows Syria with 17, Saudi Arabia with 27, the U.S. with 46, Yemen with 53, North Korea with 60, Iran with 252, and China with more than 2,000. So, but clearly, in terms of advanced democracies, we're quite alone. And finally, the path to democracy can vary. You can come to democracy through authoritarianism in South Korea and Taiwan. There's post-war occupation in Japan and Germany, two advanced democracies, though they had undergone industrialization earlier. You can have simultaneous democratic and economic development in the U.S. and the U.K., a very gradual process. So all these things are differences among democracies and advanced democracies as well. But there are also certain commonalities, despite these differences. All advanced democracies do the following. First, they approach these things in fundamentally similar ways. There's not one leader or group of leaders handing down edicts on abortion or conscription or the death penalty. Instead, they have public debate. They have interest group involvement. This is pluralism. Elites pay attention to polls. You've got the occasional use of referenda at the state level or at the national level. The second point is they all emphasize capitalism, protections of private property in the free market. And liberal democracies, we're just very liberal, do this, but also so do social democracies. They emphasize various levels of capitalism, participation, competition, liberty. The third point is that they're all characterized by high levels of capacity but low levels of autonomy. The state is charged to provide for its citizens, but it's constantly constrained by its subjects. People voice their demands, and they tell leaders when they don't like what's going on, and they influence this. The fourth point is that all these states are characterized by high levels of sovereignty, the ability to act independent of outside actors, as opposed to autonomy, which focuses on internal constraints. There increasingly, we actually find integration into international organizations that involves new forms of this social contract that we talked about in the second week of class, ceding some sovereignty in order to receive some sort of benefits, for example, security or economic benefits. So, for example, Central Europe, most Central European countries after communism were forced to adjust their defense budgets in order to enter NATO. The cost was, political. Think of massive economic transition, and having to adjust these, increase essentially their military spending at a time when they had spending on lots of other things. They were trying to get the country out of communism into a capitalist state. But the benefit was security from the imperial tendencies further east. Okay, so they did cede some sovereignty. They had to spend more than they wanted to, or than they otherwise would have wanted to, on defense. The Eurozone is a huge one. Major implications of membership. You have benefits from joining the Eurozone, but there are also limits, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. You don't have the same fiscal policy freedom that you once had. And what we do find is that with respect to all this, there's sort of a pendulum. There's occasionally this devolution. So you have, in the European Union, you have people coming together, these states come together closer and closer, and then occasionally they have these sort of revolts of sorts which bring power back down to lower levels, okay? Often as a result of limited autonomy. People demand more autonomy. The fifth point here is that all these states are oriented towards modern values, the normative connotation here, but we're talking about secular, rational, materialistic, technological, bureaucratic. There's a relative emphasis on individual freedoms over the collective, although again this varies by degree within states. When we talk about pre-modernism, we're talking about basic survival, traditional forms of authority. And this can make you more inclined towards authoritarianism. But modernism, of course, has its own problems. By the 1960s, industrialization increasingly was seen as dangerous, especially environmental damage, health problems. And so we've come into what we now call postmodernism, where you've got this secular, rational value self-expression. It's less about progress and more about quality of life, the environment, health. So all these states would stress modern values, but they've gone into a period of postmodernism. So again, focusing on quality of life. That's what happens in advanced democracies because we're beyond industrialization. The sixth point here is the economic emphasis, and it goes straight from postmodernism. These are post-industrial states. So advanced democracies are by nature, by definition, post-industrial. The majority work in the service sector. That means around 75% or above work in the service sector. The rule of thumb is if your hands don't get dirty or you don't spend your day on a machine, you are in the service sector. So finance, education, sales, high-tech industries, healthcare, business, legal services. This affects others as well, because if we're not doing the dirty work, well, then we outsource the jobs to other countries that are stuck doing the dirty work, to poor countries where people will do anything and tend to have lower skill levels. And we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. So going back to that initial chart that I showed you, an important point to bring up here is that we all in advanced democracies live in welfare states. The social expenditures are designed to provide public goods. As we expect more from the state, the government has to spend more. So note in the table, the Dutch and the Swedes, way up at the top. You've got falling birth rates in a number of countries and rising ages in a number of countries, which means older populations, fewer people to support them. You could go with migration. Another thing to do is to spend your way out of it. And so in lots of places, in Europe in particular, you find family-friendly incentives. For example, in France, mothers can quit working and earn €1,000 a month. These are social expenditures. That's about minimum wage for having a third child. Okay? On top of their 40-week fully paid maternity leave for the third child, you get 20 weeks for the first, and free nursery school. So it's a pretty good deal. In Sweden, each parent gets 18 months of fully paid leave. Okay? So these are social expenditures. And again, they're designed to equalize society and benefit society in some way. So in a moment, when we come back, we're going to start talking about the evolution of the European Union. But again, what I want to emphasize here is that there are a large number of differences that you'll find within democracies and even within advanced democracies. Everything from direct democracy, voting, military service, prisoner rights, abortion, death penalty, how they got to democracy, the path of democratization. But they do all share these commonalities here. So it's important to keep that in mind. So now we'll go into the next phase. Ding, ding.